Joseph Smith's ancestry reaches back to the Elizabethan court and the English Levant Company, as does my ancestry and most of early Mormon settlers' ancestry, those who joined the church in New England and immigrated to Nauvoo, where they were systematically assassinated, my family included. The Mack and Smith families were exiled to the United States after the beheading of Charles I, and the House of Orange Dutch East India Company had infiltrated into Scotland and financed the first Orange Revolution by Oliver Cromwell. The Macks, the Smiths, and my family, the Jolliffes, were instrumental in the establishment of Connecticut, Virginia, New York, Vermont, Hampshire. After the War of 1812, the Mack family established Detroit, Michigan, and were the founders of the Bank of Michigan. They were international shippers, owning 2 clipper ships and huge land grants. The Macks' wealth financed the Smith-Mack Mormon Church, a religious political movement instigated to facilitate migration westward to the Pacific of the United States in order to battle the British, who kept on invading the United States. It was a religious campaign called Manifest Destiny. The U.S. government was paying quite handsomely, at least in money grants and land grants of about approximately 40 to 50 acres to each of the couples or people who would move west into these growing communities, such as Nauvoo, in order to populate the Midwest. They did not want to find themselves like Australia, where only coastal cities are populated and the whole interior is left up for grabs to any invader who wanted to come in from the north, which was Canada, from the south, which was British-backed France, or from the west, which was British-backed Brigham Young. So the U.S. money and land grants is what financed the early Mormon movement through the Max Michigan Bank and other state-chartered banks. Uncle John Smith, Smith's great cousin, was a Dartmouth scholar who introduced into the United States the ancient language curriculum of Hebrew, Reformed Egyptian, which is Coptic or Turkish, and other ancient languages. Uncle John Smith was the first to hypothesize that the Native Americans migrated over the Bering Straits from Asia. Uncle John Smith also endorsed the idea of migration of fur traders from Russia, Denmark, Greenland into the Hudson Bay with settlements down the New England coast in approximately 800 A.D. Uncle John Smith and the Smith relatives were excavating and finding Viking relics that were being found along the interior of the Ohio Valley. Also, Egyptian artifacts were being excavated all over New England, which were being sent into New York and sold to European investors. Solomon Mack, the patriarch to Lucy Mack and her brother Stephen Mack, founded the bank. Solomon Mack was the patriarch and father to Lucy and Stephen Mack, who was the founder of the Bank of Michigan, a wealthy international shipper. Solomon was Jewish and married Lydia Gates, also a Jewish heiress, who was involved in shipping trade in Hartford, Lyme, Connecticut. So these two early Mormon families, the Joseph Smith families and the Solomon Max families, were responsible for settling and establishing New York, Connecticut, Virginia, Vermont, New Hampshire, Ohio, Michigan, with Detroit and Pontiac. Also, they were responsible for settling Missouri, Illinois, and Iowa. Stephen Mack and Hiram Smith attended Moore's Indian Charity School at Dartmouth College, an educational institution devoted to proselytizing Native Americans into Christianity. So these Native Americans wouldn't always side with the British as they had done since the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Oh dear. The British were paid the Native Americans very handsomely for joining their side of the wars, and the Mormon movement was dedicated to converting these Native Americans into Christianity and hopefully making them loyal U.S. citizens. Cousin Stephen Mack married Native American Hononegah, and they had 12 children, making the majority of the Smith cousins Native Americans. Joseph Smith was advised by his Chicago lawyers as far back as 1842 that he was a target of assassination. Smith's friends and admirers were no less venerable than Stephen O. Douglas, Abraham Lincoln, who sent observers to monitor the Smiths' trial in Springville, Illinois, Josiah Quincy, and Charles Adams, all of whom considered Brigham Young a despot, and all of whom contrived to force the Young and his anti-Mormon movement into exile from the United States just to get rid of that gnarly Brigham Young problem. They were known as the Border Ruffians, and Brigham Young was known for his assassins, bank robbers, and counterfeiters. Nauvoo was a port on the Underground Railroad, starting in Quincy and going up the river to Ohio, where non-Mormon ancestors, including mine, participated in trials to free wrongfully enslaved free blacks who had been kidnapped into slavery in the South under the tyrannical fugitive slave laws. Not only were anti-slavery Mormons burned out of house and business, but also non-Mormon lawyers such as my relative, John Joliffe in Ohio, who defended fugitive slaves wrongfully kidnapped into slavery. My ancestor, John Joliffe, was a lawyer in these trials, was also burned out of his business, after which he moved his business to Washington, D.C., where at the end of his life, his office was also burned down with all of his papers. Pro-slavery crooks like Brigham Young wanted to erase the past, including who was actually free and who was actually a slave. Also, who owned the real estate. The first building to go up in flames in all of these communities, you guessed it, was always the land office, which destroyed in burning flames all records of land ownership. That is why the British went into Washington, D.C. and burned the Capitol and all the records of who owned what land and land grants given by, guess what, the King of England. But anyway, let's move on. Mormon men are so shame-based about sex they can't stop obsessing about Joseph Smith's supposed sexual escapades, which were invented by his enemies in Nauvoo. From 1842, Smith spent only a few months a year in Nauvoo to conduct business, after which he was in hiding, moving from his relatives' homes located in Iowa and northern Illinois. He was nowhere near any of these numerous delusional young maids who claimed to be married to him. The men who were near these young maids, naive young maids, were impostors, acting as an impostor, acting in the name of Smith. Namely, there was a Joseph Warren Smith who John Bennett said he picked up and then oversaw his engagement and one-night marriage to a young maid. Yes, Joseph Warren Smith was the culprit who was going around impersonating Joseph Smith Jr. Anyway, Joseph Warren was a cousin whose father was assassinated at Hans Mill. But these were what we call very negative cousins. And every family has their problem children, including William Smith, Joseph Smith's younger brother, who was also known to have practiced this spiritual wifery, wife-swapping, one-night stand kind of sexual escapades. But anyway, let's move on. Warren is also the namesake of the Warren Jeffs gang of fundamentalist Mormon criminals, who was the cousin Joseph Warren Smith at Hans Mill. Joseph Smith did not have time to play around with all these young maids while he was in active hiding, but John C. Bennett, Joseph Warren Smith, the Laws, the Fosters, and the Higbees, one of whom contracted syphilis from a traveling prostitute, certainly did have time to cavort with these young maids. These men were all excommunicated when it was discovered that they were going after young unmarried women. So whether or not Joseph Smith engaged in the spiritual wife-free system of wife-swapping, which these scurrilous fellows such as the Laws, the Fosters, and Higsbys did, was not and never was the purpose of Mormonism. My goodness, my non-Mormon ancestors had British and Native American brides, known as country brides, whose marriages produced wealth in the Native American land grants from tribal chiefs, such as Stephen Mack claimed and owned under marrying his wife, Native American Potawatomi wife Hononegah. I am sure Smith was well aware of the philandering going on between these married couples in Nauvoo, because he inherited these U.S. paid convert settlers to join the Mormon movement in Ohio first and then Nauvoo, and these Mormon converts were already Cochranite wife swappers. One of his relatives was married to Lucy Smith, was one of these early Cochranites, who was very influential in the Cochranite community. So Joseph Smith was well aware of the Cochranites and their philandering ways. However, he welcomed them as long as they voted anti-slavery, which is what they were supposed to do in Illinois, and which is the reason that Joseph Smith was assassinated, period. Anyway, these experimental communities were popping up in various places throughout the United States, so it's not like polygamy would have caused him to be assassinated, because no other of these leaders who were promoting polygamy in these experimental groups were ever assassinated or had their houses burned down, except probably James Strang, because he was promoting not only polygamy at Beaver Island, he was a Mormon imposter. James Strang promoted polygamy, but he demanded that the women wear bloomers, and he was also assassinated. But who knows? It could have been Brigham Young who assassinated James Strang, or responsible for assassinating James Strang. Anyway, James Strang is one of the more colorful historical figures in Mormonism, and I just love that chapter of Mormon history, the Strang movement that went up to Beaver Island, and the James Strang was assassinated because he was forcing the women to wear bloomers. Anyway, these experimental communities were popping up in various places, and there were many forms of spiritual wifery being practiced in other areas. But the form of spiritual wife, however, Let me make it clear. Wife swapping, the form of spiritual wifery practiced in Nauvoo by lecherous old men, had no relationship to the Brigham Young form of harem polygamy practiced as an experiment in Salt Lake City, Utah. It is claimed by several of the early polygamous wives of Brigham Young that Orson Pratt helped Brigham Young come up with this whole idea of harem polygamy, but more than likely it was formed while Brigham Young was in England, where he was being tutored by his British financiers how to attack the United States and corrupt it. But let's move on. Smith was on a mission. Joseph Smith's Mormon movement was dedicated to expanding the United States to the Pacific Ocean in manifest destiny, a religious political movement, and to vote out slavery. Smith did not identify as an abolitionist because he advocated the peaceful, not violent means to eradicating slavery, and therefore he technically did not fall within the definition of an abolitionist, which was a movement who promoted violence and was infiltrated by violent British financed impostors. So all these early abolitionists, including the black women and black men, were being financed by the British and were imposters. True abolitionists, such as Joseph Smith and my family, were burned out of home and business and erased from history. So, there are absolutely no similarities between Joseph Smith and Brigham Young Mormonism. They are polar opposites, and yes, Brigham Young was part of the 2-year conspiracy to assassinate Joseph Smith. Young planted his cousin Willard Richards and the quorum of his trail, John Taylor, to shadow Smith to Carthage so they could be sure Smith was where he was supposed to be when the fake mob was sent to Carthage to cover for the actual assassins that more than likely were in the jailhouse itself. The Quorum of the 12, Richards and John Taylor, went into hiding after Smith's death and refused to testify at the Smith assassination trial because, well, they were guilty of the crime, along with their cowardly leader, Brigham Young, and their Confederate agent, Sharp, who the Higbees had entreated to join the conspiracy concocted in Nauvoo when Joseph Smith was absent. There are stories about these Confederates, which are now called the Council of 50. These were the Council of 50 traitors that met in secret, including women, and swore blood oaths to assassinate Joseph Smith. That is our dear Council of 50, which included not only a few women, but also non-Mormon men. So with Brigham Young being out of town or out of Nauvoo, just having left to promote the presidencyship of Joseph Smith, a ridiculous cover story. He wanted to not be anywhere near the action in order to have an alibi. In order to understand history, you must always ask yourself, qui bono, or who profits? Brigham Young profited big time by the Smiths assassination and died one of the wealthiest men in the United States after he'd built faithful Mormons out of millions of dollars in unpaid labor and under a reign of terror that would have stolen that would make Stalin proud. This version of Mormon history is so well established, you can find it by the most rudimentary search in Wikipedia. Look up Stephen Mack Jr., look up Stephen Mack Sr., Dartmouth College, John Smith, lexicographer. It's all in Wikipedia. But what is very worrisome is Stephen Mack Jr.'s Wikipedia entry has erased Hononegah, his Native American wife, from his entry. In fact, it doesn't mention Stephen Mack had been married at all. And Stephen Mack Jr. only became as famous as he was and as wealthy as he was because of Hononegah. So not only are they erasing Mormon history, but they're erasing Native American Mormons from the history books. So everybody must be very vigilant in keeping this history alive. Otherwise, we're going to be left with, I guess, just men, white men, and their stupid versions of history, of non-history, and their stupid versions of non-history. I know there are some nice white men. So please, don't all of you come rushing to defend the white male gender, because I know there are a few of you that are good, just like there are a few bad women and a few bad Mormons and a few bad Native Americans, etc., etc. And there, it doesn't matter your race or your color. It matters, like all the white men like to say, a content of your character. Oh, if I hear the content of the character anymore, I think I could probably fall asleep into a deep slumber and wake up hopefully in the next century.